Hello and welcome to our Friday webinar. We're on with Dr. Stephanie Lamb. Welcome, Dr. Lamb.
Hello.
And Arroyo in the background there.
Yep.
So we're on for another episode of Avian Vet Insider, and today we're covering pet birds and toxins, right? So this is like a pretty wide ground here. All right. Let's see, before we get there, just let people log on. And we'll probably get to maybe questions at the end, or we have time, we'll get to your question, but use the Q&A button, not the chat feature. And I'm going to make you a co-host, Dr. Lamb, because you probably have a share screen for us, right?
I do.
You always have nice presentations. So, okay, I just made you a co-host. All right, and let's see. Let's let people log in for just another few seconds here. Just what, do you have any, let's see, Halloween just happened. So did you have any, did you have to work on Halloween? Did you have any clients, like any
Yeah, I
people?
did have to work on Halloween.
So did you have any birds dressed up? They can't, just kidding. No, I don't.
No, I was expecting, because sometimes on Halloween, if you work on Halloween, people will bring in their pets with cute little costumes, but nobody did it this year. But I did actually have one chicken owner who brought in 2 chickens, and she said that she was going to bring them in their costumes, but like was a little too late to get them into their costumes. So that would have been funny. Whatever
Oh my
it was,
gosh.
a chicken in a costume would have been funny.
That would have been hilarious. I heard like is it geese? People dress up like there's a whole company that makes clothing line for like geese.
Really? I haven't heard that. That's cute.
I imagine it might be like for them. But yeah, they would, oh, yeah, apparently it's a thing. So we'll have to look that up, and I'll talk about it if I ever find the right. But so did you dress up but as a vet, or did you dress up scary vet?
Well, some would say I dressed up scary to some individuals.
Because that would really the birds, right? With the
Yeah, I was
seeing like a
scary for
wig or
certain.
something.
So, but
They're like, why am I?
one year I did try to dress up in the exam rooms. I had a big parrot hat that was like a big, like made my head look like a parrot head. But the patients did not like it. So I was like, okay, I probably shouldn't do that anymore. Did we just lose? Oh, she's coming back. For a moment to log on, and then I can get started. I think you're muted, Laura.
So then my connection just went bloop. I made you a co-host, so don't worry about me anymore. And so your presentation. So we'll get this started and hope that my internet does not do any glitches. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm gonna let you take it away, and
All right.
we'll go from there. Thanks.
All right. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started with the PowerPoint that I have.
Okay.
This out of the way. All right, so this month we are talking about toxins. What is the truth about toxins? And thought it was probably a good time of year to talk about it, given that it's the holiday season, and we just had Halloween, where there certainly can sometimes be some toxicities because of birds maybe getting into Halloween candy that they shouldn't. Hopefully they aren't. It's always a possible thing. So something to avoid. And then with upcoming, Thanksgiving and other holidays, there's always the potential for birds to get into trouble, getting into things, or maybe people having things around the home that they wouldn't have other times of year that could potentially be problematic. So we're going to go ahead and get into this topic. It's not going to be just, holiday focused or anything like that. We just thought it was a good time to do it. Definitely, it's going to talk about toxicities that could happen any time of the year. Okay, now the first thing though I want to go over is just a little bit of semantics to go over the definitions of what actually is a toxin, because when I was getting this talk together, toxin is something that's kind of specific, but there's other words that are used too. There's poison and there's venom that's used. So a poison, a toxin, or a venom, those are all terms for any substance that injures the health or destroys life when absorbed into the system, into a body system. And that's a definition from a Merriam-Webster dictionary. Now, more specifically, a poison is any substance with an inherent property that tends to destroy life or impairs health. It's a more general term. So we could have called this talk, you know, poisoning problems or something like that, and it would have worked out well as well. Now, toxin is a little bit more specific. A toxin is any poison that's produced by an organism created by plants or animals. So interestingly, a toxin is something that is created by life and harms life. And then venom is a poison that is secreted by very specific animals, and it's usually injected by a bite or a sting. So it's even more specific in the terminology. So I'm going to use the term toxin because it's kind of colloquial and an okay term to use, but I just wanted to point out the definitions of things beforehand in case anybody really wanted to know the real specific terminology and what's appropriate. Okay, the other thing that's important to know when it comes to toxins is there is always a dose that is associated with a toxicity. A lot of times people will hear that something in particular may be toxic, and whatever that item is, they may then be afraid to have their bird near it, around it, or if their bird touches it, they may be concerned that, oh my gosh, the bird touched this particular item that is known to be toxic. I'm really worried that the bird is going to actually have a toxicity and induce a toxicity from, being around or associating with this particular thing. And the reality is it's only going to a toxin or a poison, or even a venom, is really going to induce a problem when an animal gets the appropriate dose. And we'll often express that in terms of milligrams per kilogram or units per kilogram or parts per million. And so the other thing that's important to know is that when we're talking about those doses of what dose induces toxicity and what animal, we really know it more for dogs, cats, horses, cattle, some of the more domestic species. We don't necessarily always know what the toxic doses are for birds. So that's something that we do have to keep in mind, is that what is a toxic dose for a dog may not be a toxic dose for a bird. They may be toxic at a lower dose. They may be toxic at a way higher dose. Birds are actually pretty amazing with their metabolism. And they sometimes really have to have high doses of like medications compared to other species for it to be effective. And so same thing with the toxicity. They may have to sometimes have a lot higher amounts of something than another species for it to actually induce a toxicity. So sometimes small quantities of an item may not be toxic for a bird if it is below that toxic dose. So that's just something I want to say right off the bat here, because if all the things that we're going to go through, if your bird has been exposed to them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've ever been toxic. It's really dependent upon the amount that they actually get. So, all right. I do have quite a few things, so I'm hoping we'll get through everything and have questions, available at the end, our time for questions at the end. But I wanted to first go over some lead toxicity cases or heavy metal toxicity cases. And I actually have had several heavy metal and lead toxicity specifically cases in birds throughout my veterinary career. And so I'm going to go over a few of those cases with you guys so that you can kind of see how these birds presented in different ways. So this particular bird was a 2-year-old rose-breasted cockatoo. And it came in because it was just lethargic, so just acting quiet, not really active, sleeping more, but it was also wobbly. And so with it being wobbly, it just wasn't able to support itself well on a perch. It was kind of like a little bobblehead sort of, teeter-tottering back side to side. And when we see a bird with that particular sign of being sort of wobbly, we worry about neurologic problems that could potentially be making us have that sign. So we decided to do some diagnostics on that bird, and we took radiographs. And on the radiographs, I have them over here. You can actually see that there are some bright structures sitting in the portion of the stomach called the ventriculus. So birds have two parts to their stomach. They have the proventriculus, which is the soft glandular portion, and they have the ventriculus, which is the more muscular portion. And a little gritty material can kind of sit in that ventriculus. And there is some gritty material, because you can see these like white opacities. That's just a little bit of mineral density stuff that the bird has chewed up. But that's not the problem. The big problem is the real bright white stuff. So that really highly bright white structure in a few little spots that you can see, looks like 3 really bright white structures at least in both of these images. So when we see something like that, that opacity on a radiograph tells me that that's metal. And I need to do some investigation to find out what kind of metal that is. And so what we did is we ran blood work, specifically looking at lead and zinc, and it came back that this bird had high lead levels. So what we did with the bird is we got her on some chelation therapy, and chelation therapy is something that helps bind heavy metals, and it helps them to excrete them from the body. But that's what's in the blood. So it's help binding that lead heavy metal element from the blood and excreting it from the blood. The other thing that we have to do is we have to get rid of that stuff that's sitting in the ventriculus. And there's a few different ways that can be done. And in this particular individual, we decided to give grit because there was a study that was done looking at different types of things that you can give to birds when they have a metal density in the stomach to see if something helps move that metal density out of the stomach quicker than other things. And they looked at things like peanut butter, mineral oil, different sizes of grit, and I think also Metamucil, if I remember correctly. But all these things that we often think like, oh, they may be bulking or binding agents that help excrete things. But what grit does is it helps grind things down. And so we got this bird some oral grit to help it kind of grind that sort of stuff down and help things move out of the GI tract better. Another lead toxicity case, a different bird. This was a macaw. It was 2 years old, and it presented for picking at its feet. I've had a few birds that have had some lead toxicity and they've been picking at their feet, and it's probably that there's some odd nerve tingling sensation is my suspicion. I don't really know that's making them do that behavior of picking at their feet. So we ran blood work on this bird. It had some other diagnostics as well, but it also had high lead levels. It had radiographs as well. These are its radiographs. But when you look at this bird, what you can see from the difference from the cockatoo and the other images is I really don't see any bright white metal opacity sitting in the stomach. In this bird here, we can see this is the proventriculus. Again, that smaller, more glandular portion of the stomach, and it goes down into the ventriculus. It is sort of superimposed with the knees. The bones of the knees are kind of like right over that stomach, but I should still see some bright white metal object in there if it's in there currently. And then on this image too, I don't see anything. This is right where the stomach should be, the ventriculus. I don't see anything sitting in there. And so this is an example of a case where this bird probably ate something that had lead in it quite a while ago, and it excreted that thing just fine, the actual object itself, but its body sort of had the lead element leach out from the actual object itself, get into the blood, and cause the patient to become toxic. So in this particular case, we just did chelation therapy. We didn't have to do the oral grit because there was nothing in the stomach to help pass it along. But then on follow-up, after doing the chelation therapy, the bird was thankfully stopping with picking its feet. But this is a really good example. I've had lots of people say, well, let's just take an x-ray and let's see if there's anything lead in there. And if there's nothing lead in the stomach or crop or intestines, then it doesn't have lead toxicity and we can rule it out. But we can't. We really have to do actual blood lead levels to truly see if there is any lead or heavy metal toxicity of other types present. Okay, one more lead toxicity case. This is little Jende Conure, 6 years old. It came in also because it was lethargic, like that first case. It was having some balance problems and also possibly chewing on its feet. It had radiographs taken and it had a metallic object sitting in the stomach. You can see it right here, and I actually, on this image, did go ahead and measure the object itself, so that number that's right next to it, that's the size of what it was. It was 0.07 inches, so pretty tiny, but certainly something sitting in there. When we look at the other view, we can see it sitting in that ventriculus. We did go ahead and run blood work on this particular individual, and it was found that this individual did have some high lead levels. It was also treated with chelation therapy and oral grit as well, to try and help break stuff up. On follow-up, it was no longer lethargic and the balance problems had resolved, but it was still picking at its feet. So that feet picking problem likely was unassociated in this case with lead toxicity, whereas the last one we talked about, the picking of the feet had resolved itself after treatment with chelation therapy. This one did not. So there's lots of different reasons a bird could pick at its feet, and this one did not seem to be associated with lead toxicity, since it did not have improvement with getting chelation therapy. Just an example of a zinc toxicity case, because I also wanted to go over that particular type of toxin. It's also considered a heavy metal toxin. An example is just of a 8-year-old Quaker parrot, as you can see in this photo. This is not a Quaker parrot, but I'll explain a little further more about why I chose this picture. And the way that this Quaker presented is it presented for just acting a little off. It just wasn't quite right. Like the owner had thought, it seems to be a little quiet. It seems to be not doing its normal behaviors. So there was concerns that this patient was, just not right in some way. So what happened with this particular individual is that we did do blood work with this individual, and what we found was that it did have high zinc levels. And when we're looking at zinc in birds, zinc is actually something that is supposed to be present in the body at certain levels, and if it is at like lower levels, that's appropriate, that's normal physiology, and that's okay. But if it is higher than those normal physiologic levels, then we do worry about zinc toxicity actually being present. When we did radiographs on that particular individual, it did not have any changes on the radiographs. And so, again, back to an example of you don't always see actual evidence of this metal object sitting in the stomach, like would be so helpful to just easily identify every time, but not always there. And so we do have to do these blood tests to really tell what's going on. Treatment with this particular one was we did go ahead and we did do chelation therapy as well, actually get it on the appropriate medications that help bind that zinc in its system and help to excrete it. And then the follow-up on this one was that the zinc levels, we got back down when we did chelation therapy, and the bird was acting more normal. Now, the reason that I have the picture of the cage up is because how we believe that this particular bird got zinc toxicity, because that's one of the things we always question is, well, how did this happen? Where did the lead come from? Where did the zinc come from? What did the bird get into in its environment that caused it to get this toxicity? And in this particular case, the bird had been in sort of an not the greatest cage, and we believe that the bird probably got zinc toxicity from the little soldering at the edges of the cage itself, so kind of like where the junctions are of the bars. There is some soldering that happens to get those sort of to stick together, and there can be zinc in that soldering, and so the bird probably did a bit of picking and chewing, and that's how it got its zinc toxicity likely. So the owner got a new cage for it as well, a different cage that was more appropriate, and has been doing great since. All right, so next toxicity that we're going to talk about is avocado. I think a lot of people know about avocados in birds and how The actual toxin that is present in avocados is a molecule called persin. That is the name of the actual thing that causes toxicity in the avocado. The dose does vary based on the species of bird, just like we've talked about earlier, that the amount that actually leads to toxicity and leads to problems is going to be variable. And we don't always really actually know what that is. It may be more toxic for budgies than canaries. That's just something that people have said. So maybe our little passerines can manage it better than our citizens do. And no one will probably be doing any major avocado toxicity studies on birds because we would be inducing harm to figure out what those doses are that are toxic from one bird species to another. So at this point, it's a little bit of speculation. Now, what does avocado actually cause? Like, what is the toxicity that or what does the toxin induce, and how does it cause damage? Well, what it does is it has the ability to cause necrosis of the skeletal muscle, so basically death of the skeletal muscle. That skeletal muscle, those cells can become damaged and they are no longer functioning. And cardiac muscle is so important and vital to health. I mean, we need to have normal contractility of the heart and normal cardiac muscle function in order to pump blood around the body. If we have cardiac muscle necrosis, we may not be able to pump that heart as effectively as we should. We can then have them go into congestive heart failure. And one of those things that could be seen is pericardial effusion. So like you'll get fluid that builds up around the heart sac because the heart kind of sits in a little sac called the pericardial sac. And there's normally a tiny, tiny bit of fluid in there. But when they have cardiac muscle necrosis, they actually can build up a bit more fluid in there. And then that can lead to its own problems and unfortunately can even lead to death. And then it can also cause skeletal muscle necrosis as well. That, really may be less of a real problem. But it's certainly not something that's pleasant for the bird to have, but really the big problem is that cardiac muscle necrosis. And I think it's kind of intuitive as to why that would be more detrimental because, again, the heart is really important for normal contractility, function, getting blood throughout the body. And if you're not having that heart function well, then certainly you may not be getting blood around the body appropriately, or could be even quite detrimental, not function at all, and then we can go into sudden cardiac arrest and death. The signs that are seen, because, okay, I can tell you what the problem is that it causes, but can you actually see that with your eyes? No, not when you're directly looking at the bird. So the signs that someone may notice is the bird's just quiet, it's lethargic, it's not acting right, it's not eating, it starts to have respiratory distress, so maybe open beak breathing, tail bobbing, that sort of thing, and then death within 24 to 72 hours after ingesting the avocado is how quickly it can cause them to pass away. Okay, coffee and chocolate. This is one that I think most people recognize as well, is a potential toxin for a variety of animals. And collectively, coffee and chocolate are called the methylxanthines. That's kind of like the molecule that is the group that they fall into. The different types of methylxanthines that are out there: caffeine, it's in coffee, and theobromine, which is what's in chocolate. And of course, back to the whole dosage thing, the dose depends on, again, the individual species that we're talking about, but also depends on the product. So dark chocolate is more pure chocolate. It has higher levels of theobromine. So dark chocolate is much worse for an animal to get into than milk chocolate. Milk chocolate, as it gets processed and has sugar added and milk, and it tastes really delicious, and is what a lot of people prefer over dark chocolate, although everybody's different in what type of chocolate they like. But some people prefer that milk chocolate more so than that dark chocolate, but it's a lot safer if an animal eats milk chocolate than if it eats dark chocolate, because after all that processing of the chocolate and adding all the other parts to it, the milk and the sugar and all that stuff, it really means there doesn't need to be as much of the actual chocolate in there. So that means there's less of the theobromine, which means there's less of the toxin. So there's just less toxicity for the animal. The problem that it causes, it essentially overstimulates that nervous system. And so the signs that a animal may show when they have methylxanthine toxicity is vomiting, diarrhea, an increased heart rate. So like here, when they come into the office, I could listen to their heart and hear what we call tachycardia, which is a very fast heart rate. They could also have muscle tremors. They may have seizures because, again, it's overstimulating that nervous system. So in that overstimulation of that nervous system, you can induce a seizure, and it can lead to death. But again, it depends on the type of the product that the animal is getting into, and again, different dosaging for different species. Okay. So, another one that I think not everybody's aware of, but many people are aware of, when they get a bird, they may be told, hey, don't feed your bird any seeds of any fruits, no apple seeds, no of the hard stone fruit seeds, anything like that. So the reason for that is because in seeds, not all seeds, but some seeds, apple seeds, apricots, nectarines, plums, peaches, in the seed or in the pit, there is a toxin called amygdalin. This is a molecule that actually can release cyanide. And many people know that cyanide has the potential to be toxic for humans. And absolutely, cyanide is toxic for animals just as it is for humans. And so there's a small amount of this amygdalin toxin that is in the seeds and pits of these fruits. So the bird would really need to eat a lot to actually get a toxicity. So if your bird eats one apple seed, two apple seeds, probably even all the apple seeds in the apple, a single apple, if it's a macaw, it's probably not going to have any toxicity. I have to say, I have never personally seen a bird come into the office with toxicity from eating something like this. So, which tells me that they really do have to eat quite a bit, because I have certainly had owners come in who were worried that the bird got a seed or two, or sometimes I'm talking to owners and it's a new first time that I've met this owner and their bird, and they're, maybe we're talking about, hey, what things are good to give at home and what things should you avoid as far as, foods and everything. And I'll often say avoid the seeds of any, apples or any of these apricots, nectars, plums, peaches, that sort of stuff. And I've had owners go, well, my bird's eating apple seeds all the time. And they seem to be doing totally fine. So it definitely is a good example of, the dose is really what makes something a toxin. And they really have to eat a lot for it to be a problem. So not that I'm being a proponent to say anybody should have their bird eat apple seeds or any of these other items. I don't think people should, but if they get into one or two apple seeds, don't worry too much, because they really need to eat quite a bit more. Now, the problem, what is it that cyanide does? Let's just say an animal did eat way too many of these things, or, maybe they, got into the peach pits, there was a whole pile of them or something, and they really were able to break into them and ingest a lot. But that, again, would also have to be a larger bird because of, the strength of that is required to open that pit up. What that cyanide does is it actually interferes with oxygen's utilization by the cells in the body. So basically, maybe an animal is in a perfectly normal environment where oxygen is at adequate levels, but that oxygen is actually not getting to those cells where it needs to be in order to work to have normal cellular metabolism and function. And so animals could present in respiratory distress because their body knows that they need oxygen. The mind is saying, I'm not getting enough oxygen. You need to have increased respiratory effort to get more oxygen into the body. And because they're not getting enough oxygen as well, they could be lethargic. They also have their mucous membranes. So for those species who have more pink mucous membranes, you wouldn't be able to tell this on somebody like Arroyo, who's got a black tongue, or a gray who's got a black tongue. But if you have like a cockatiel who has a nice pink tongue, you may see that color change. That pink may turn to like a blue, or what we call muddy mucous membranes, where it's just not that nice soft pink that it should be. It's like bluish, purplish, kind of dull looking. And then, of course, if you don't get enough oxygen to your tissues, yes, it can result in death. So absolutely a very serious possible problem can occur from these things. It's just that they really have to have a lot for it to be a problem. Okay, next thing, what about garlic? So in some species, they are able to have toxicity occur from garlic. And the particular toxin that is in garlic is alicillin or allyl thiosulfonate. And in mammals, I have the dosing written there. So they need between 5 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight in a dog to have toxicity from garlic. But in birds, it seems like they have to, if it even is toxic, they must need to have much higher doses than mammals. I bring it up because it's something that we don't really actually know if it's true toxin in birds or not. I have definitely known several birds who have eaten garlic at much higher doses than what is presented there on the slide for a mammal, and they don't get toxic. They don't have problems. They seem to do just fine. I wouldn't advise someone to just say, okay, go ahead and give your bird high amounts of garlic and don't worry if they are okay. More my point is we don't actually know what the dose is and how toxic birds actually can get from garlic. So because we don't know, generally speaking, we recommend probably staying away from it too much. But again, sort of if they get a little bit, it's probably nothing to be too worried about. The way that it causes problems, it interferes with sulfur groups and leads to oxidative damage, cellular damage, and then anemia, possibly by hemolysis. So basically, red blood cells get broken apart. And because you get this oxidative damage in cells, it can damage cells. Particularly those red blood cells, they break apart, the animal becomes anemic. And that's what we see more in dogs, is they can get what's called immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, and it can be induced by garlic toxicity. The signs that can potentially be present would be things like lethargy. They're just, again, acting quiet. They're not acting like their normal selves. They really are not doing their normal behaviors. Again, those species where we have mucous membranes that we can see a little bit more color to them, they may be pale. And then lastly, death could potentially occur. But again, we really don't know what the dose is in birds, and it seems like it is probably quite a bit higher than what we know about in mammals. Which brings us to the next thing that's very similar, and that's onions. Onions also have the potential to be toxic for our bird friends. We definitely know that it's more of a problem in mammals. And again, just like I had the dosing for the garlic, the dosing for causing toxicity in mammals is the same. 5 to 10 grams of onion per kilogram of body weight of the mammal is going to cause them to have toxicity. But it's unknown really if birds actually truly become toxic from onions. It is more of a problem. We do know in mammals that it's more of a problem if it's raw. So in reality, most people are doing some sort of cooking with onions. You certainly can eat them raw and prepare them raw, but a lot of cuisine that we are eating has them cooked in some way. And so if they're mixed into some food item, they may not be so toxic when they have been cooked. And maybe that's partially why we don't really see too many onion toxicity cases in birds. But again, maybe it's just that they aren't actually toxic from them. Maybe it's a mammal thing. We look at what we know about mammals and we kind of say, well, birds can't do what mammals can't do, and that really could potentially be wrong. But again, until we know better, best to probably err on the side of caution and not really have our pet birds be too exposed to it. The particular toxin that's in there is propyl disulfide and thiosulfate, and it's very similar to the way that garlic causes toxicity. It interferes with certain sulfur groups and can cause oxidative damage, can also cause anemia by hemolysis or that breakdown of red blood cells, and then it can also cause liver disease. Again, the signs are going to be very similar to what happens with garlic because their toxins are essentially doing the same mechanism to induce damage to a cell. So they may present being lethargic, having those pale mucous membranes in those species where you can see where they don't have pigment on the mucous membranes, like dark pigment on the mucous membranes and more pink pigment, they may become pale. And then of course, death. But again, just side note at the bottom there that we already mentioned, that cooking seems to break down that toxin. It seems to be more of a problem if it's raw. So if a bird gets a little bit of onion that has been cooked in some way into a product, it probably is unlikely to be a major problem. And I also, again, have to say, I don't believe I have ever seen a bird actually with a problem from onion toxicity. Okay, another toxin is xylitol. And so what is xylitol? Maybe some people recognize the name, have heard of it, or maybe, haven't heard about it. What xylitol is an artificial sweetener. And the actual toxin is xylitol. It's found in gum. It's found in toothpaste. You can go to the grocery store and you can actually buy like a bag of xylitol. I've seen it at the grocery store before because again, it's an artificial sweetener. So people may use it in baking or in some sort of cooking to be a sweetener for the food that they're preparing. And we actually have seen cases of toxicity with this in birds. So there was actually a paper that had shown that xylitol had been mixed in water and set outside, and it was mixed to 21.8%. That was the concentration that it was in the water, and it was set outside, and some wild birds, Cape sugar birds, had access to it and drank it. And there were birds that then when they drank this, they were dying. So this was a wild, natural situation that happened. And what it ended up doing is what it can end up doing is it can cause liver necrosis. So basically it damages liver cells, and then pancreatic necrosis, so damages cells in the pancreas. And the problem with damaging cells in the pancreas specifically is there's two major components to your pancreas. You have what's called the endocrine pancreas, and that endocrine pancreas is producing hormones like insulin, glucagon, and then there's the exocrine pancreas, which is the portion of the pancreas that is secreting things that are important for enzymes that are important for helping break down and like the processing of food. Because you have normal like pancreatic secretions that go from the pancreas to the intestines and mix with the food that has just been ingested and helps to break it down. And so if you have necrosis of that pancreas, you will damage that exocrine pancreas, where that's producing those enzymes that are helping to break down food. But more detrimental is when you're damaging the endocrine pancreas, which is the portion that is really producing the hormones like insulin. And you can have individuals have blood sugar problems. They may just be very lethargic. They may be ataxic, meaning they're acting like they're drunk because their blood sugars are inappropriate, and then it can even cause death. In that paper where these birds had ingested it, some of them were acting drunk, and then they got better and they flew away. But it's unknown, did they go somewhere else and possibly die? Did they have some prolonged pancreatic damage or liver damage that caused them to pass away later on? It is something that, unfortunately, because it was wild birds, it's hard to track some of that stuff. Now, it does seem to be safe in chickens. So even within our birds, there's about 10,000 species of birds, so we have to realize that not all of them are going to act the same. So what's toxic for this species may not be toxic for another species, or what dose is required to induce toxicity in a Cape sugar bird may be totally different than the dose that is required to induce toxicity in any other species. But in parrots, we just don't know. We really have no clue if xylitol is toxic for them. So this is certainly one that I would highly recommend people just don't have their bird have access to it in any way, because it has the potential to be quite detrimental. And something like liver necrosis or pancreatic necrosis, they may not have problems right away. They may have problems later on, a few weeks after they've had exposure, because of just the time that it takes for there to be metabolic derangements and metabolic problems occurring in the body. So I would recommend that it not be accessible to birds in any way. All right, what about rhubarb? So rhubarb, it has the potential to be toxic, but the toxin is actually in the leaves. And so that's something that's very important. In the leaves, there is a compound called oxalic acid, and oxalic acid is actually in lots of different things. And you will find it in other like dark leafy greens as well. It's just that in rhubarb, in the leaves, it's a pretty high concentration of it. So that's why we talk about rhubarb being toxic, but we may not necessarily talk about kale, which has some oxalic acid in it. We don't talk about that one being toxic, but we talk about rhubarb being toxic, is again because of that dose. There's so much more in the leaves in the rhubarb than other plants. So, but the portion that we will eat when we eat rhubarb, or we have rhubarb as a part of, different culinary cuisine, is not the leafy part, but is the stemmy part. And the stemmy part really isn't the problem so much. So that's something that's important to keep in mind, is the whole plant is not the problem. It's just a portion of the plant that's the problem. I have the dose written there for mammals. No clue what the dose is for birds. The way that it causes damage is it can cause kidney damage. So it actually can lead to problems within the kidneys. And so the signs that you may see may be more associated with kidney problems. But I have just general signs here, which, as I'm sure you have noticed throughout this presentation, sometimes they're just very non-specific signs. Again, lethargic, that can be so many different things. As we've already talked about, I think every single toxin we talked about, they're lethargic. So it's not a specific sign, which is frustrating. And of course, it's not specific to toxins either. There's plenty of other disease processes that can make an animal lethargic, but point is that if you have a lethargic pet, bring it into the vet, have it checked out, try to figure out what's going on with it. It can cause anorexia and can also lead to death. Now, interestingly, I wanted to add this in here too, because sometimes there are things that are toxic to people, but aren't toxic to birds that we do know about. So as I've already mentioned, like with the onions and the garlic, we know that they're toxic for mammals, and who knows that they're toxic for birds, but we just kind of say, maybe stay away from them because we just really don't know. But there are some things that we know are toxic for people or mammals that birds can have, that maybe even a part of their diet, that is not a problem for them. So I have a list of several things here. Raw acorns, not a problem for birds. Castor beans. There is a toxin called ricin in castor beans, which is, that's like very, very, very toxic for humans. But black-winged lovebirds have been seen to eat castor beans in Africa. No problem, they do fine. Hot peppers, it's not so, I mean, it does cause a little cellular damage, but not to the point. So technically, yes, you could consider it a toxin because it's causing cellular damage, but it's not to the point where it's causing systemic damage and systematic problems and death. But it is technically has a toxin, and that toxin is capsaicin. And again, remember, goes back to dose as to how much is there to actually induce a problem. So most people aren't having any sort of problems, but you know, those people who do those hot pepper challenges, I guess. You know, it's the capsaicin that's causing problems and causing quite a bit of discomfort, but nobody dies from a hot pepper chip contest. So but the point is that birds actually can tolerate capsaicin much better than we can. So they just seem to like really not have problems from it. And it actually is even something that may protect chickens from salmonella. So there may be some health benefits from it. China berries, severe macaws are seen to time their breeding with when these trees are fruiting and may be eating from them, but we know that they're toxic in mammals. And then cocklebur, another thing that's toxic to people. The extinct Carolina parakeet ate these pretty regularly and may have incorporated the toxin into the skin. We don't know. This is just one of those weird possible things that like maybe this is just folklore, but some people have said that maybe they incorporated the toxin in the skin because there are reports of cats dying after eating some of these parrots. So like maybe that toxin that causes damage for those mammals got into the birds, doesn't cause that many problems, but then when they become a prey item for a predator, cause problems. So I don't know how true that is, but it sounds like some interesting part of history that, of course, we will never find out at this point because the Carolina parakeet, unfortunately, is extinct. I did want to just go over a couple of things about venom, and specifically talk about rattlesnake venom. I personally have never seen a parrot that's had envenomation by a rattlesnake, and I live in Arizona. We do have them here. And I have personally seen it in a chicken, and it's also been reported in raptors. And honestly, when we look at the reports of birds that have had natural envenomation by rattlesnakes, it's chickens and raptors that are the ones that are more reported on in the literature. The way that rattlesnake venom causes problems, it causes tissue necrosis, it can cause coagulopathies, and what a coagulopathy is normally when you get a cut on your hand or wherever, cut on somewhere on your body, tissue damage somewhere on your body, you bleed, right? Well, you should have what's called clotting factors, and you have platelets. Birds have thrombocytes. They're the equivalent of a platelet in birds, that are in the blood that kind of go to that area wherever the tissue damage is and kind of seal the area up and stop the bleed. But these venoms can actually induce a problem where that clotting can't happen. So maybe those platelets aren't able to congeal together. Those clotting factors that are involved in that whole clot formation just are not functioning the way that they should, and then an animal can just bleed. So a tiny cut can just keep bleeding and bleeding, and lead to an animal bleeding out. Hemorrhage, as I have written there, so that's bleeding out, and then respiratory failure, where the respiratory system just shuts down. I mentioned these in this webinar. I know we mostly focus on parrots, but I mentioned it even though it's mostly reported in raptors and chickens, that it's always a possibility that if you have an outdoor aviary where your birds are and maybe you live somewhere where there are rattlesnakes, it is something that is possible. So just be mindful of these sort of potential things that could happen. There are treatments that can be done if a bird is to present with a known rattlesnake envenomation. We can give them things like Benadryl. It's diphenhydramine. It stops the histamine release that can be induced by these venom, or by the venom itself. We put them on NSAIDs, which stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Those also help with pain. They help reduce inflammation. Sometimes we're lucky and we may have access to anti-venom that actually is the antidote to the true antidote to the venom itself. But that might not be available depending upon where a person is, or where the problem actually happens. And then antibiotics may be necessary for secondary infections if they occur. So, or preventing secondary infections that could occur. So there are things that we can do for these individuals if they do present to the hospital. Unfortunately, they can pass away from this. But if we get them in time, and also if we get them, where maybe the dose was a lower amount, maybe the snake did not, inoculate a huge volume of venom into the animal. And there's lots of different things that determine how much venom a rattlesnake releases that I'm not going to get into. So if an animal got a lower dose, then maybe it's not going to have as severe of a problem and has a better potential to potentially survive something like this if it gets supportive care. Okay, so I am kind of right at the end there, but before I get into the questions, there's just one other thing that I wanted to mention. Right now we just went over a few different types of toxins, and the reality is there's tons and tons of different things that have the potential to be toxic. Again, going back to dose. But if anybody is ever concerned that their bird potentially had exposure to something that's toxic, something that is helpful to do is there are pet poison hotlines that you can call, that you can talk with a veterinarian, and they're usually there's many veterinary toxicologists, so people who are veterinarians who are boarded in the actual specialty of toxicology, that they will get on the phone with you. They'll talk you through okay, what was the bird exposed to? How much did it get? What is the bird's weight? Trying to figure out if this is potentially the amount that they got was toxic, something was toxic for the animal, or not. They may be able to say, hey, this is not at a toxic level, you're okay. Or, hey, we don't know what the toxic level is. It has the potential to be toxic. Maybe you need to get to the vet. And then what's nice for us on the veterinary side, who are working in private practices, when these animals come in, if they have reached out to the pet poison hotlines, they often already have a plan set in place by that veterinarian who helped identify whether or not this thing that the bird got into could potentially be toxic. And so they may have okay, well, the animal needs to get these fluids or this particular dose of this medication, and we recommend that they get it for this length of time. So it can actually be really, really helpful. There is a fee associated with reaching out to those sort of groups, but it is a fee that is absolutely well worth every penny, because they really, really help out quite a bit. So that being said, I know we have just a few more minutes here at the end of our webinar, and I was hoping to be able to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Okay, so I'm back and I got a good connection now, so hopefully I won't cut out here. So yay, just in the nick of time. So we do have questions for you, and let me see here. Where'd they go? Okay, so Kate's looking for a way to identify outdoor plants and shrubs and tree. Oh, where'd my thing go? Okay, wait, it just disappeared. Hang on one second.
I hit stop share, so maybe I caused a problem.
Okay, sorry. No. I'm just having all sorts of technical difficulties there. So Kate is looking for ways to identify outdoor plants, shrubs, trees that would be safe for their Timna to eat. Do you know of a comprehensive resource? Are the same things poisonous to birds, all breeds of birds, and dogs and cats? Also interested in indigenous native plants that would grow in my Timna's native habitat that they could grow here.
Okay.
And thank you.
Okay, so that sound like 3 different questions. The second question of are all the things that are toxic for is one thing toxic for all different species? Birds, dogs, cats, different species of birds? No, the answer was no to that. What's toxic for one species may not be toxic for another species. But then to answer the first question of what sort of things could you plant, is there some sort of resources that you could identify to let you know, like, hey, I can plant this particular plant and it's great for this particular species? So one thing I know on, I don't know this, I don't think it's on the regular Lafeber site, but on the Lafeber Vet site, which is a resource for veterinarians, there is a great little list that has all the plants that are considered to be safe, or not all the plants, but a long list of typical plants that are considered to be safe that you could have for your bird. So that's, you could reach out to your veterinarian, ask them if they're a member of Lafeber Vet, and ask them to print that little list out for you. I've printed it out for people many times. So that's one resource. But the other resource that's actually really good too, that might be more specific for wherever it is that you live, because that particular, the Lafeber Vet resource is sort of generic, right? Because it's kind of hitting all different parts of the US mostly. So depending upon where you live, you could reach out to your local university. Their like agricultural extension in the universities often has good lists of what plants are like native to the area where you are, what plants are safe for pets and what plants are not safe for pets. And so like for me, I'm in Arizona, and I at one point had looked into the University of Arizona's their agricultural extension, and they have a great little resource of, okay, here's these common plants, and this is toxic, this is not toxic. So your local university has a good potential to be a really good resource. And then about planting some plants from native to like where the Timna is, that is a question I don't have a good answer for, because I don't know all the different, like the botany from that area. Could you safely get plants that are native to there? That's something that I probably also reach out to like a botanist at a university and see if they knew what plants are native to the areas where the Timnas are, and could you easily get some of those somehow in the US? So yeah, that one's a little tougher of a question for me to answer.
Oh
Or the
yeah,
third
that is
part of
fast.
that.
I know that I believe that some of the national, like American Bird Conservancy and stuff, they have a, like, if you want to transform your yard into a wild bird feast ground, like for make plants friendly for migrating birds or wild birds. I know they have those kind of resources. Maybe it's something that would also be safe for pet birds, parrots, like
Potentially.
possibly.
Again, there is so much that we just don't know. But if a particular plant is known to be safe for a variety of different species, we can hope that it's also safe for parrots. The reality is there's a lot that we don't know, and we aren't going to have answers for everything. So there are potentially, sometimes you're going to take certain risks, but hopefully that risk is pretty low if we have evidence to show that it's safe for other birds.
Okay, maybe sunflowers. Those are beautiful, and okay, there you go. Plant some sunflowers. Okay, so we had a question. When you mentioned toxic dose, are you referring to TD50? Also, do you use EDTA to chelate lead? And they want to know, doesn't EDTA present issues for a bird's kidneys?
Right. So the TD50 is toxic dose 50, and that's usually what's used in studies like with a product to see when it causes 50% death in the population. So some of the toxic doses are based off of stuff like that, and some of them are not. Some of them are based off of like other studies that have happened in, honestly, mostly dogs or cats. And then the calcium EDTA, or EDTA, I said EDTA, we usually use calcium EDTA. That is what we are using as one of the things to use to chelate for lead toxicity. There's a couple different chelators. Calcium EDTA is one of the most common ones that's used. It's a injectable. DMSA is an oral. Calcium EDTA, and honestly, a lot of the drugs we use, the dose that we use has the potential, if we give too much, to be toxic, just like any of the doses that we're talking about for these natural things that are toxic, right? So if we overdose, yeah, we could potentially cause problems. But we are dosing it at a very specific dosing range based on a milligram per kilogram amount for the weight of the bird. And then also we are usually giving them fluids. If we are doing EDTA chelation therapy, we are giving fluids at the same time to help maintain their hydration in the body so that we are doing the best that we can to avoid kidney problems. And I have to say, the birds that I've treated with lead toxicity or zinc toxicity with calcium EDTA, I haven't had anybody go on to develop kidney problems, but I'm always doing it with fluids.
Okay. All right. And then I'm going to guess this is our final question for the day. Michelle wants to know, is there a specific lead toxicity blood test, or would it show in the standard lab test?
It's a specific test. There are certain changes you may see on the regular test, like sometimes it's going to cause some red blood cell changes that may pop up on the regular CBC, but it doesn't always. And so if you really want to know if your bird has lead toxicity, you have to do that lead blood test that's specific.
Okay. All right. There you go. And I was just going to point out, so some of the things that our birds like to eat, like, some households with dogs like to, do the vacuum clean around the cage. And I remember that Lafeber took out the raisins in their products and swapped them, I think, for dates, because there was that study that grapes or raisins could cause some stomach kind of issues with dogs. And they figured that, if any bird is throwing like their Nutriberry or whatever out of the cage and the dog is scooping it up, they just felt like they had an obligation to also protect the pets in the household that might not even eat bird, that might accidentally eat the bird food.
Right.
That was
well, and that's a good one. Yeah, the grapes. So it actually causes kidney problems in dogs, and it's not every dog either. So it's like it is a little bit of variability in dogs, but that's a great one. That's toxic in dogs, but it's not toxic in birds. So
okay. So if your bird is flinging grapes out of the cage and you've got a dog that likes to eat things that the bird flings out of the cage, keep that in mind. There you go. Right. All right. Oh, and I have to announce our giveaway winner today. That is going to be Shelly Orloff. Congratulations. I believe we're giving out the Senior Bird Nurtuberries again, as well as another Lafeber product, every bird's choice. And just to remind you that Lafeber Senior Bird Nurtuberries can be fed at all life stages, but they're especially beneficial for older parrots. All right. Let me think here. Oh, so and then next Friday, next Friday, Lisa, who's been working behind the scenes today, she's going to be on, and this is going to be, I don't know if you've ever had an episode like this, but it's me ask Lisa anything about grays. So not just, it has to be bird related, obviously, but she'll probably cover other bird species, but very specific to if you have a question about your African gray, you should join us. On that note, gosh, thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time, Dr. Lamb. Appreciate all that fabulous information. And again, your slide presentations are like, they just really hammer home the information. So I hope people can go back if they have any doubt, go back and rewatch the episodes, and then share them and with your bird loving friends as well. So
all right.
On that note, I'm going to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. All the best to you and your flock. Everyone stay safe. And thanks again for a wonderful presentation. Thanks, Dr. Lamb.
Bye.
Until next time. Bye.